Hi folks, it's Professor DiBiase with part 2 of our discussion regarding recognizing and avoiding plagiarism. So last week I had you go through a number of examples and assess whether or not the examples that I provided were examples of plagiarism, and to provide your rationale for whether they were or they were not. So over the past day, I've gone through both sections of ENW 100 to look at the responses that you gave, and I would say that on average, most of you got about half of the questions right, and overwhelmingly, most of you got the same 3 wrong. And I'm guessing if you think back, you could probably guess which ones they were. But we're going to go through all 6 examples. We'll talk about why they are or are not examples of plagiarism, some of the finer points, some of the questions that kind of arise out of these examples. I'll also address some of the questions that people posted in the discussion board, because I think some people asked some good questions, so we'll deal with them here, and some we'll deal with now, and some we'll deal with in a video that I'll be posting later this week, more specifically about citation systems. But why don't we go through the examples? So in the first example, a student includes a quote from a source, but they fail to put the quote in quotation marks. And if we look at the example that I provide, it says in Holland's article, she argues that autobiographical memory has not received adequate attention. And most of you correctly identified that this is an example of plagiarism. Now, there might be a little bit of gray area here because, as the example shows, the student writer has acknowledged that there is an author from which this information is coming. They give the name of the author. However, the issue that we see in this example is that because the quote, right, this direct quote is not in quotation marks, that then it implies that the quote is actually a paraphrase and that the language being used here is the student's language and not the original author's language. That is problematic, right? If the exact language in the article is autobiographical memory has not received adequate attention, then it needs to be acknowledged as such, with a quotation and a citation, right, that would point you to where in the article that quote occurs. And it might seem like this is kind of a really kind of corner case, and this is largely not an intentional example, but rather an unintentional example, because the student may have forgot to put the quotes in or did some sloppy note-taking. But it is relevant because in the world of academia, even things like your specific wording or the specific language that you use to describe a phenomena or an idea can be really critical to how one establishes themselves as a scholar. And so even though this seems like a relatively honest mistake, it still is an example of plagiarism from a very technical perspective. Now, if we move to the second example, a student paraphrases a portion of a research article but does not include a reference to the paraphrased text, e.g. no footnote or parenthetical citation. Most of you did note that this is plagiarism. A few of you tried to argue that because it's in their own words, it can't be plagiarism, and yet this is an example of plagiarism, and I'll sort of explain why. Part of the issue here, so there's a couple of issues, right? So to step back for a second, right? A paraphrase is a reframing of someone else's language into one's own words, right? And we might do that for a couple of reasons. We might do that to make the language easier to understand, or we might make it as a stylistic decision, or we might make it because in one's particular field, the expectation is that one paraphrases rather than uses direct quotes. So for example, in fields of study that make use of APA citation, such as psychology, there is a strong preference for paraphrase over direct quotation. And that's fine, right? But when you paraphrase, you still need to direct the reader to the portion of the text that you are paraphrasing, right? So that might mean if it's a physical text or even a digital text with page numbers, right, including the page numbers that people can find it, at least in MLA. In APA, you don't necessarily have to use the page number, but you do need to cite the source and the year in which it was published. And this is for a number of reasons. One, to again acknowledge that the information is coming from someone else's scholarship, right? That people don't think that what you're paraphrasing is your own original research or your own original scholarship. But also so that the person who's reading it can go back to that source and either learn more about the topic or even make sure that you are using the material in an appropriate manner, right? That you are not misreading the original text. So even when you are paraphrasing and putting things in your own words, you still need to offer a formal citation to show the reader where that paraphrased information is originating from. But again, for most of you, this seems to be a pretty obvious one. Okay, example 3. A student in an intermediate level history course includes a paragraph from a paper that she wrote last year. And this is the first question of the 6 that most people identified incorrectly. And the reason is that for most students, the concept of self-plagiarism, the idea that one can plagiarize oneself, is a pretty novel concept, and it's not particularly intuitive, right? If these are my ideas, how is it possible that I'm plagiarizing myself? And yet, this is a legitimate concern in professional scholarship. And the best example that I can give, right, is let's say I write a scholarly article, and that article gets published in a scholarly journal or presented at a major scholarly conference, right? Well, academic journals are expensive. They cost individual subscribers quite a bit to subscribe, and they cost databases money to include those issues in the database. And the reason why people are willing to pay for those subscription fees is because they expect that the scholarship that they are reading is original scholarship. So if I were to publish an article in one journal and then include a portion of that article in another journal, then I have, in several ways, deceived the publisher, the second publisher, who thought they were getting an original piece that they could publish and market, but they're actually getting kind of warmed over leftovers from another piece. Now, does this mean that you cannot make use of content that you have produced previously? No, unless the professor has an explicit prohibition on doing so. But you do need to acknowledge that the material that you're making use of comes from another source, right? That it has been published in another format, right? And although you're not publishing it publicly, in many senses, your form of publication is submitting that paper for a grade, right? You're submitting it for credit, right? You've already received your compensation for it in the form of the credit that you received by doing it. And so what you'll frequently see in scholarship, right? You might see in an article a note saying like, portions of this article originally appeared in another form at such and such conference, or portions of this chapter originally appeared in a doctoral chapter published in blah, 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 blah. Right? And so you're acknowledging that the material in here has been drawn from some other kind of source. Now, I also think it's a good idea, if you were to do something like this, that you speak with your professor and make sure that he, she, or they are okay with it, right? Maybe they are, maybe they're not, but you definitely want to I think, ask permission rather than have to ask forgiveness after the fact. And I think it's worth noting, like, this was something that I absolutely had no idea about when I was a first-year student in college. And in fact, I was talking about this with my wife yesterday, and she was also saying that she was stunned when she learned that she couldn't use material from an older paper in a newer paper. And so, this is something that you have to be really careful about. Now, I want to pause for a second because there were a couple of questions that came up in the discussion boards that I think pertain to this. So one was that, one about, like, well, how would someone know that you did this? The reality is that most professors, barring some really kind of extraordinary circumstances, probably would not notice if you did this unless you had taken that professor for another course and then they had already seen the material. But really, we're not concerned at this moment with whether or not one would get caught, right? That's not really the issue here. The bigger issue is sort of the habits of mind that we're trying to cultivate and the practices that we're trying to cultivate, and the degree to which we're operating within the appropriate ethical framework for scholarly writing and for scholarly research. So I think that's something that we need to sort of be aware of. Another question that sort of came up was, well then, how does one avoid self-plagiarizing if you find yourself writing on similar topics? And I think that it's not as hard as you might think it is. So one way is to be very proactive and say, okay, so I'll try to give examples from my own experience. If you're taking a literature class and you're looking at like a Shakespeare text, right? and then you are taking another literature class later that is also dealing with Shakespeare, right? You simply decide that although you might be writing about the same text, you're going to write about it in a different way, or you're going to explore it from another angle. And then the other half of it, I think, is you can cite your previous work, right? And you can kind of come up with a citation that at least signals to the instructor that, part of this is coming from some previous work that you've done, and that you're kind of trying to build off of that previous work, right? That you're continuing to explore these ideas in this particular kind of paper. So moving along, right, that was kind of a tricky one. So then I move on to a somewhat easier one, right? A student cuts and pastes a large section of a Wikipedia article into his paper without referencing Wikipedia, and I believe everyone, correctly identified that this is an example of plagiarism, right, in a very traditional sense. Copying and pasting is problematic for any number of reasons. Now, the student who did this, thought they were doing a good thing. It was an international student. English was their third language. And they were concerned that I would prefer to see writing about the topic that was, clearly written, rather than have to work through, his writing. And we had a good conversation about that, and he resubmitted the work. But it's also worth noting, right, that there are concepts. I think one reason I include this example is, and this anecdote, is that conceptions of what constitute plagiarism are culturally constructed to a certain degree, right? The idea that one can own an idea, right, that one can have intellectual property, is an idea that's relatively unique to Western Europe and the Americas, and it's less common in other parts of the world, because it's a fairly abstract concept, right? The idea that you can own an idea, and that's more of a cultural convention than anything else. And so that, I think, played somewhat of a part in the student's decision-making process there. Example 5. Okay, I like this one a lot. A student is taking a class on American politics and American lit, and they write one paper on the influence of literature on politics and submits it for those courses. And a lot of you said this is not plagiarism, partly because the ideas are the student's own, and also, it's just one paper, right? The reality, though, that this is another variety of self-plagiarism, right? That you cannot submit the same work for two courses, right? And there are a lot of reasons for this. So the first is that essentially once you've submitted the paper for one course, it belongs to that class, right? You have submitted for this course, you are in essence publishing it for that class, and therefore to submit for another class has put you in a situation where now you are wholesale plagiarizing yourself. Additionally, if you think about how academia sort of works in terms of its logistical structure, right? You receive credits for the courses that you take, and those credits are predicated on a certain amount of original work as laid out by the syllabus for your course. And although most syllabi do not explicitly mention that you cannot use material from one course in their own course, that is, I think, a very prevailing assumption, right? That goes unstated, that the work that you produce for the course is going to be unique to that course, right? That I'm not going to be getting something that you're giving to someone else. So how do you handle a situation like this? I think there are ways to do it. I think the best solution is really, again, to clear it with your professors. And it might be possible to negotiate some sort of situation where you can develop a kind of combo paper that addresses both of the topics and can be submitted for both courses. Not every professor is going to go along with it, but the consequences of having that conversation are far less dire than the consequences of trying to submit the same paper for two courses and then essentially losing credit for one of those courses. Now, a question I often get asked